Montana Territory, July 1879. The sun had not yet burned off the morning chill when Weston Lake rode into the mining town of Dry Creek, dust baking into his coat, his horse slick with sweat. He was not a man who sought out trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him, especially when it came to Rosalie James. She was standing by the general store's porch, skirts dusty, chin lifted, staring down a U.S. Marshal who thought a badge gave him license over decency. Weston saw the moment the Marshal grabbed her arm too hard, too familiar, and he was off his horse before it stopped moving. "Get your damn hand off her," Weston said, voice low and steady. Marshal Kent turned, still holding Rosalie's wrist. "This is government business, Cowboy." "You best ride on. She is my wife," Weston said. "Law or not, you laid hands on my wife." And with that he hit him. One clean punch. The Marshal dropped like a sack of oats, sprawled across the dusty street, groaning. Gasps rose from the onlookers, but Weston did not look at them. His eyes were on Rosalie. Her face was pale, jaw tight. "He came by yesterday, said he had orders to search the property for a fugitive." Her voice shook, but just barely. "I told him he needed a warrant. He came back this morning angrier." Weston's fists clenched. "You all right?" "I am now." It was not the first time he had protected her, but it was the first time he had said it, called her his wife in front of the whole town. And maybe it was not true on paper, but it had been true in his heart for months. They had met the previous winter, when Weston rode through Dry Creek on his way to deliver cattle east. Rosalie was running her late father's feed store alone, a woman with no family left and no patience for nonsense. She had two young siblings, Tessa and Theo, barely 10 years old, abandoned by their mother and clinging to Rosalie like roots to dry soil. Weston had stayed longer than he meant to. Helped fix the store's roof, repaired the corral, brought supplies up from Helena when freight wagons got snowed in. He never asked for anything, but Rosalie handed him coffee each morning like it was something more than kindness. And sometimes, when the children were asleep, they would sit by the stove and not speak, just listen to the fire pop. Weston never said how he felt, and Rosalie never asked him to. But after today, there would be no more silence. Sheriff Horner came hurrying up just as Marshal Kent groaned and tried to rise. "What the hell happened?" the sheriff barked. "He touched her," Weston said. "I knocked him down." That's the short of it. The sheriff looked between them, eyes narrowing. "She your wife?" "She is now," Weston said, and Rosalie's breath caught beside him. The sheriff's jaw ticked. "This town don't need more violence." "Then keep your lawmen from putting hands on women," Rosalie snapped. The sheriff grunted and gestured 2 men to help the marshal up. "You better get out of sight for a while, both of you." Weston nodded. "We will." They rode out together, her siblings packed in a small wagon behind them, pulled by Weston's second horse. They headed west, toward the old ranch Weston had half restored last year, tucked between pine ridges and a shallow creek. It was quiet out there, and far from the long reach of a marshal's pride. Rosalie sat beside him, her hands gripping her skirts. After a long moment, she said, "You should not have done that. He hurt you." He grabbed my wrist. "You could have been arrested." "He hurt you," Weston repeated. "That is enough for me." She looked at him then, really looked. The wind caught her hair, dragging strands across her cheek, and Weston reached to tuck them gently behind her ear. Her breath hitched. "I meant it," he said. "Back there, when I said you are my wife. You have not even kissed me, Weston Lake." His lips twitched. "Then maybe I should fix that." She stared at him, cheeks flushing, but she did not pull away. The wagon rattled behind them, the trail stretching on. But in that wide silence, something shifted. "You really mean to stay?" she asked. "I have been halfway in this life with you for months. I want the whole thing. You, the children, the farm, all of it." Rosalie turned her head, eyes wet with something she refused to let fall. "You sure? I come with 2 little ones and a broken-down store. I come with a busted-up barn and a mule that bites." "We will make it work." She laughed, soft and surprised. Then, quietly, "I want that too." Weston reached out, took her hand where it rested on her knee and held it. She did not let go. Behind them, little Tessa sang a song off-key, Theo drumming on the wagon seat with his palms. They crossed the ridge just as the sun began to rise higher, casting gold across the valley below. Weston pointed to the old ranch house, weathered but sound, the fields wide and ready. "We will fix it up," he said. "We will build something good." Rosalie leaned into his shoulder. "We already are." They reached the ranch by late afternoon, the land stretching quiet and open beneath a pale sky that hadn't yet decided whether to rain or clear. The house stood where Weston had left it last fall, gray boards, 2 rooms, a lean-to shed off the side. The wood pile was low, the fence in the back had one whole panel missing. Still, it held a kind of waiting stillness, like it had been listening for footsteps to return. Theo leapt from the wagon before it fully stopped and ran toward the shallow creek that bordered the edge of the pasture. Tessa followed, dragging the small cloth doll Rosalie had sewn for her from scraps. Weston helped Rosalie down from the wagon bed, their hands meeting in the middle. She didn't pull away. "I'll take care of the horses," he said. "You and the children go on in. It's not much, but it'll be dry tonight." Inside, the air still held the scent of old cedar and ash. Rosalie found the kettle where Weston had left it. She filled it from the rain barrel and set it on the stove without speaking, her movements brisk, sure. The rhythm of caretaking came back easily, though her shoulders remained tight. By the time Weston came in, the fire was crackling low in the stove, and Tessa had curled up on a folded quilt near the hearth, thumb in her mouth. Theo sat cross-legged by the door, whittling a stick with a small pocket knife Weston had let him borrow weeks ago. Rosalie turned when Weston stepped in, brushing damp palms on her apron. "There's not much food," she said. "I only brought what I could carry in 2 sacks, some flour, beans, dried apples. We'll need more." "I know where to hunt," Weston said. "Plenty of mule deer in the hills. I'll set traps for rabbits come morning." She nodded, then hesitated. "Do you think that Marshal's gone back east to file a report?" "He'll try. But he'll have to explain how he got knocked flat in full daylight. I reckon his pride's heavier than his badge. He might come back. If he does, I'll be here." She looked at him then, and something unreadable passed through her eyes. Not fear, not quite trust yet either, but it held the shape of leaning toward something solid. That night, the wind picked up, sweeping down from the ridges in long sighs. They laid out the bedding on the floor, quilts layered with care. The children were asleep before the moon rose. Theo curled beside his sister, one hand on her back like he was guarding her in his dreams. Rosalie stood near the small window, arms folded. Weston joined her, stepping close enough to feel her warmth. "When I was small," she said quietly, "my father built a house from scratch up in the Shields Valley. Took him nearly 2 years. Every nail straight, every board planed by hand. He said a home wasn't just shelter, it was a promise." Weston looked at her profile in the moonlight, the way her mouth pulled tight at the memory. "I never thought I'd have that again," she said. "You will," he said. "Right here." She turned to face him. "You're sure about this?" "About me, the children, the Marshal's shadow hanging over us. I'm sure," he said. "Not because it's easy, because it's right." She reached up slowly, fingers brushing the side of his face. Her touch was cautious, like testing the strength of ice before stepping out. He didn't move, just let her look at him. "I've never kissed a man I trusted," she said. "You want to change that?" She nodded once. He kissed her then, careful and sure, his hand resting lightly at her waist. It wasn't hurried or bold, it was a promise, steady as the land beneath them. When they parted, her eyes were wet, but she didn't look away. "I want to build something with you," she whispered. "We're already laying the first beam." Outside, the wind quieted. The old pine behind the house creaked once, then stilled. And inside, with the children breathing soft and steady, and the fire burning low, two people stood side by side, no longer waiting. By the third morning, the rhythm of the place had begun to settle into them like dust into old floorboards. Theo rose early, dragging Weston out with him to check the traps they'd set along the creek. Tessa stayed near Rosalie, helping grind the last of the cornmeal and humming tunelessly under her breath. The barn still leaned, but Weston had begun to brace the frame with lengths of pine he'd milled the year before. He worked with quiet concentration, sleeves rolled, hat tugged low against the sun. Rosalie watched from the garden patch as she turned the soil with a rusted spade, the children's laughter drifting faintly from the trees beyond. She hadn't spoken of the Marshal since they left town. But she hadn't forgotten. Neither had Weston. That evening, when the children were asleep, Rosalie took the ledger from her satchel and spread it open on the table. The pages were worn, corners curled from years of use. She dipped the pen and began writing neat column supplies, debts, crop yield estimates, all things she'd once kept for the store. Weston sat across from her, drying his hands with a bit of flour sack cloth. "You planning to open a shop out here?" "I'm planning not to starve," she said, not looking up. "If we're to make this place work, I need to know what we've got and what we're short on." He leaned forward, elbows braced on the table. "You've done this before." "I had to. After Papa took sick, there wasn't anyone else." Weston nodded slowly, then reached for the small tin box near the stove. He opened it and took out a folded envelope, the edges softened with age. He set it beside her hand. "My mother wrote this before she passed. Told me not to waste my life chasing cattle and silence. Said land's only worth something if there's someone to share it with." Rosalie glanced down at the envelope, then at him. "Why show me now?" "Because I think she was right." She closed the ledger. "I don't know how to be anyone's wife, Weston." "You already are," he said. "You just don't know it yet." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the envelope and unfolded the letter inside, eyes scanning the looping script. Her mouth softened as she read. When she finished, she folded it carefully and slid it back into its sleeve. "She sounds like someone who saw things plain." "She was," Weston said. "Didn't speak much, but when she did, it stuck." Rosalie stood and crossed to the window. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the fields. After a long pause, she said, "I think I was always waiting for something to end. The store, the worry, the ache. I never thought something new would come instead." Weston rose and joined her. "You think we're something new? I know we are." She turned toward him, and this time when she kissed him, it wasn't hesitant. It was the way a door might open after a long winter, slow, steady, full of warmth. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest. "I want to build a room for the children," she whispered, "and shelves by the window and flowers in the front, even if they don't take." "Then we will," he said, "one board at a time." Outside, the night deepened. The wind had shifted, warmer now, the last traces of spring giving way to high summer. In the stillness, something took root beneath the floorboards, something neither of them spoke aloud. But it would grow steady and sure, just like them. A week passed. The barn's new beams stood solid under Weston's hammer, and the hills around the homestead turned a deeper green under the weight of coming summer. Thunderheads bloomed most afternoons, but the rain stayed in the distance, leaving the air thick and waiting. Rosalie had begun stitching curtains from a length of faded calico. She didn't say what they were for, but Weston noticed she measured the windows in the back room twice before cutting the fabric. Theo had taken to following him through the fields barefoot, asking questions about fence lines and the way soil should feel when it's ready. Tessa kept a ribbon tied around her wrist, the same one Rosalie had worn in her hair the day Weston first walked into the feed store. That evening, Weston came back from hunting with a pronghorn lashed over his saddle. He cleaned it behind the shed, hands steady, while Rosalie salted down the meat and hung what she could to dry. The rest they boiled slow with onions and wild mint she'd gathered from the creek bend. "I saw hoof marks up by the ridge," Weston said as they ate. "Didn't belong to anything I've shod." Rosalie looked up from her bowl. "How fresh! Yesterday, maybe the day before. One horse, maybe two. No wagon." She wiped her fingers on a scrap of linen. "Could be ranch hands cutting through." "Could be," Weston said, then didn't speak again until Theo and Tessa had gone to bed. Later, he stood outside by the corral, oiling his rifle beneath the faint starlight. Rosalie joined him, arms folded against the cool air. She didn't speak right away, just watched the outline of his face as he worked. "You think he's looking for us still?" she asked. Weston didn't look up. "I don't think he's the sort to let something go." "I've been wondering," she said after a moment, "if I ought to write to Judge Latham. He handled my father's will, might help us make things right legal." Weston slid the oiled cloth into his pocket. "You want to do it proper? I want to know this place can't be taken from us, that if someone comes asking, we have paper to say it's ours." He nodded. "We'll ride into Bozeman at week's end. Get a license drawn up. You sure that's what you want?" Rosalie looked past him toward the house, where a thin light glowed behind the curtain she'd just hung. "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't." They were married under the cottonwoods 3 days later, with the judge's clerk as witness and Tessa clutching a handful of sage like it was a bouquet. Rosalie wore the same dress she'd worn the day Weston met her, mended at the sleeve. He had shaved, combed his hair, and buttoned the clean white shirt he'd kept tucked away for something worth using it on. After the papers were signed, they rode home slow, the wagon creaking behind them, the children nodding off in the back. Weston reached over and touched Rosalie's hand, his fingers brushing her knuckles. "You look like you belonged to this land before I ever set foot on it," he said. "I did," she said with a small smile. "But now it's ours." That night they opened the back door of the house to let in the breeze. Rosalie lit a single lantern and set it on the table. The room was quiet except for the frogs down by the creek and the faint rustle of the children's breathing. Weston leaned against the frame of the open door, watching the dark settle across the fields. Rosalie stepped behind him and rested her cheek against his shoulder, her hand sliding into his. "You think it'll last?" she asked quietly. "This," he said. "I'm counting on it." He turned and kissed her, slow and quiet, her palm still warm in his. When he pulled back, she didn't let go. "I've never had anything that felt like it wouldn't be taken away," she said. "You do now," Weston said, "and I'll make sure it stays that way." Outside, a coyote cried out in the hills. But it was far off, and the house stood strong against the dark, with nothing but steady breath and the warmth of a single lamp to hold the night at bay. Weston rose before first light, as he always did, but found Rosalie already awake, seated at the table with a length of linen spread out before her, needle moving in slow, practiced strokes. A pot of chicory simmered on the stove, its smell filling the quiet house. She glanced up when he stepped into the room, her eyes softer than the early light filtering in through the windows. "Couldn't sleep," she said, tying off the thread. "Tessa's grown out of her shift again. I thought I'd get ahead of it this time." Weston poured himself a cup and sat across from her, watching the way her fingers worked, steady and sure. "You always think 2 steps ahead." "I can't help it," She folded the cloth. "There's peace here, but it's not the same as safety." "Not yet. They haven't come back," Weston said. "Maybe they won't," she nodded, but didn't answer. Outside, the wind had picked up, blowing dry across the hills. Weston spent the morning checking fence posts along the east edge of the pasture. The ground was cracked where the water had pulled back, and he made a note to dig another channel from the creek if the dry spell held. Theo followed behind with a sack of nails and a hammer nearly too big for his hands, but he didn't complain. By noon, Rosalie had taken the wagon into town with Tessa riding beside her. Weston had offered to go, but she'd insisted, said it was time she walked back into Dry Creek on her own terms. She had tucked the marriage license into a satchel, along with a list she wouldn't let him see. Weston watched her drive off until the dust settled behind the trail, then turned back to the fields, jaw set. He trusted her. That wasn't the problem. He just didn't trust what might still be lying in wait. The hours passed slow. Theo helped muck the stalls, then ran down to the creek with a tin pail and returned with a half-dozen crawdads, red claws snapping. Weston helped him build a pen of stones and watched the boy crouch beside it, utterly absorbed. It was a small thing, but it filled something in him he hadn't known was hollow. Rosalie didn't return until the sun had begun to dip low, the wagon heavier than when she'd left. She climbed down with dust on her hem and a new iron skillet tucked under her arm. Tessa held a parcel of wrapped lard cakes in both arms like treasure. Weston met her at the hitch. "Everything all right?" She handed him a folded document. Latham filed the deed. He said the Marshal's been reassigned to Dakota Territory. Seems he took one too many liberties and someone finally noticed. Weston let out a breath and nodded. "So that's settled." She stepped closer. "I saw Mrs. Kettering in town. She asked when we'd be bringing the children in for school. We can manage that. She also asked if we'd be at the harvest dance next week." Weston raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to go?" Rosalie smiled slowly. "I want to dance with my husband in plain sight. I want the town to see us together. Then I'll find something that doesn't smell like horses," he said. "We'll go." That night they ate by lamplight, the new skillet already blackened from the fire, and laughter rising warm between mouthfuls. Theo recounted how the crawdads had tried to escape, only to be foiled by Tessa's shrieking. Rosalie reached across the table and took Weston's hand, lacing her fingers with his. It was the first time she'd done it in front of the children. Later, after the house had gone still, Weston stood on the porch with her, the stars spread thick above them. The wind had quieted for once, and the only sound was the distant rustle of cottonwoods near the creek. "I never thought I'd want to belong to someone," Rosalie said, voice low. "But I've never felt more myself than I do with you." "You belong to yourself first," Weston said. "But if there's room, I'll stay beside you as long as you'll have me." She leaned into him, her head resting just beneath his jaw. "Then we've got a long road ahead." They stood that way until the chill deepened and the moon crested high. The following week, Weston shaved close and wore the dark coat he'd once bought for a cousin's wedding and never used. Rosalie pinned up her hair with a ribbon Tessa had chosen and wore a pale green dress that caught the lantern light when she walked. They arrived at the dance just after dusk, their wagon trailing behind a small procession of neighbors. The music was already drifting through the open hall, fiddle and banjo weaving together in a tune that tugged at memory and something lighter. Inside, hands clapped and boots struck the floor in rhythm. When Weston offered his hand, Rosalie took it without pause. They danced through 2 songs, then 3, her cheeks flushed and eyes bright. Mrs. Kettering passed with a knowing nod. Sheriff Horner tipped his hat. And when the children fell asleep on a borrowed quilt in the corner, Weston and Rosalie stayed just a little longer, swaying slow to a tune that didn't need steps. When they finally returned home, the air was thick with the scent of wild sage and the warm hush of summer settling in. Weston carried Theo from the wagon, his small arms looped loosely around his neck. Rosalie lifted Tessa, her daughter's cheek nestled against her shoulder, hair smelling of hay and sweetbread. Inside, they laid the children down, then stood in the doorway of their room, the lantern casting a gentle glow across the space they'd built together. Rosalie reached out, touching Weston's collar where it had gone crooked from the dance. "We did it," she whispered. "We made a home." He took her hand and kissed her knuckles one by one. "We did." They lay down beneath the quilt she had sewn from scraps, bodies folded close, the sound of the wind outside like a lullaby. Outside, the fields stretched wide and quiet, the fences strong, the barn upright. The store in Dry Creek had a new keeper now, and the Marshal had vanished into another posting far away. There were no more loose ends, no more waiting for the other shoe to fall. Just a woman who had carried too much for too long, and a man who had learned that strength didn't mean silence. Just a home with 4 hands tending it, 4 feet dancing through it, and 2 hearts steady in their choosing.